Good morning. And I don't think this week's sermon is going to be quite as shocking or controversial as last week's sermon. However, we still are hitting a subject which has some controversy. And that subject is divorce, because there are a lot of opinions on divorce in the church. One of the things I remember when Linda and I were married is that we started our marriage with a boycott. Not by us, but by one of our friends. And I asked him to be an usher on our wedding, and he said he couldn't be an usher, and not only could he not be an usher, but he was a close friend who said he could not even attend our wedding. The reason? The reason was because Linda was branded with the Scarlet D, divorcee. And on top of that, I was marrying a divorcee, and therefore I was just as terrible as she was. And he refused to come to our wedding. And he felt bad about it, but not bad enough to look at the Bible and not bad enough to find out what the truth was. We're going to find today that there are a lot of various scenarios with divorce that we have to look at, and frankly, we don't have all the answers to what is permissible and not in the Bible either, which we'll see as well. Now, to start with, before we get to the portion on divorce, we're actually going to continue for a few verses on what we had last week with basically married or not to marry with single people. If we take a look at verse 6 is not really a controversial verse, but a verse that some people make controversial. And it says, "But this I say to you by way of concession, not of command." Well, immediately what comes to mind with a lot of people is, aha, finally we hit that spot in the Bible that's not inspired. Because it's not a command. Paul's saying what he wants to say here. Well, that's simply not true. What he's saying is God is allowing him to give some practical advice here. And it's not an absolute command that you do this, but it's still inspired. So what's happening here is this is not a controversial verse. This is a verse for people that are looking to put controversy into the Bible, who usually don't believe the Bible in the first place, but are just looking to pick a verse out of the air and say, see, gotcha. If we go on to verse 7. Verse 7 says, "Yet I wish that all men were as I myself am. However, each man has its own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that." So again, we're continuing on where Paul was talking about should you stay single or should you get married? And what Paul was saying is, if you have the gift of singleness, if you are able to function and not burn and not require a spouse, then you'll be able to do more for the church. But it's not a command that you do that. Paul's saying, I wish you guys were all like this. But he's not commanding them to be like that. One of the things that Linda and I have noticed is that we've had dogs for a number of years. We've got some cats also. But we had 2 Rhodesian Ridgebacks for a number of years. When they passed away about a year ago, we got another Rhodesian Ridgeback. Dogs are trouble to take care of, but in particular if you know Rhodesian Ridgebacks. Rhodesian Ridgebacks are like 90 to 100 pounds of muscle that's strong-willed. Now, they're very friendly dogs also. And sometimes that's the problem. If some of you have actually come to our door and found out, our dog wants to greet you. Our dog wants to say hello. Well, that's nice, but when you have 90 to 100 pounds, well, she's only about 85 now, I guess, because she's still a puppy, or he is rather. When you got about 80 pounds or so of claws and teeth and everything else jumping up to say, I love you, that can be problematic when you walk through the door. That dog is strong-willed. And in addition to that, we can't just take and say, oh, well, we're at church now. Why don't we just stay out for the entire day and maybe we'll come home late tonight or something? You can't leave the dog at home alone for 12 hours or 14 hours at a time. And when we travel away this Christmas and New Year's for our trip, we can't just leave. We have to have someone stay at the house to take care of the dog. And the cats as well, but they're a little easier to take care of. My point is that when you have pets, especially a dog, you're taking on a responsibility that takes away from your freedom. In the same way, a single person doesn't have the responsibility of caring for the spouse, caring for the children, doing the family type things that a married person would, and therefore has more time to devote to the church. By the same token, Paul also made it clear last week that if this is not your gift, then whatever you do, don't fall into immorality. Go ahead and get married. But all he's saying in verse 7 is, I'm just saying, I wish you were this way, but if you're not a problem. So that's where, again, it comes in, but not command. If we look at verse 8 says, "But I say to the unmarried and to widows, that it is good for them if they remain even as I." Again, this is Paul's practical advice. One of the key things to look at here that's critical is he's treating the widows the same as the unmarried. So when we're considering what happens with the widows should not be grouped with the divorcees because, frankly, a widow is absolutely free to remarry, date, whatever. It's not a problem. A widow should be pretty much the same as a single person as far as their ability to remarry or to date. So again, there's different rules for widows than there are for divorcees, but we can see that because he's talking about to the unmarried or to the widows. Again, he'd rather have them remain single, but not a command, and certainly not if it's going to mean immorality. In verse 9, he sums it up with, "But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn." Again, Paul speaking by permission, Paul giving practical advice and saying here, look, if you have to marry, go ahead. It's not a sin. It's perfectly honorable to be married. Now, we just finished up that one section there that we pretty much started last week, but I deliberately left off. We're now going to get to the point where we start talking about divorce. Because divorce is a different situation. And one of the things we've got to ask ourselves right from the very start is, does the Bible contradict itself? Because at first glance, if you look at the words of Paul and you look at the words of Jesus, they appear to be very different when it comes to divorce. Are they really different, and what's being said? If we look at the words of Jesus, one of the things he said in Matthew 5:32, he said, "But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery, and whosoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Pretty simple. If it's not adultery, you're committing adultery. You simply can't divorce for any reason other than adultery, according to what Christ is saying here. Now, the problem is that's taking that verse and pulling it completely out of context. Anytime you hear Matthew 5, 6, or 7, bells should go off in your head saying Sermon on the Mount, or Sermon on the Mount. And the reason is because the Sermon on the Mount was given to a specific audience, and it was a headline version of what Christ is saying. It's not meant to be in-depth teaching. There's many, many spots in the Sermon on the Mount where we can see the teachings are later expanded on, and that all he's really doing is giving headline news, essentially. So when he's saying this, the reason he was saying this is he was talking to a culture and a group that literally says if you want to divorce, as a man, your right to divorce, all you have to do for absolutely any reason is walk up to your wife, tell her she's divorced, and kick her out. That's what it had come to in that day. It was not favorable for the woman, that's for sure. I mean, you could literally wake up one morning and saying, "Your eyes are too close together. We're divorced. Get out of here." That sounds petty, but there was literally any reason you want. And that was the audience he was telling this to. Was Christ going to go into saying, here are the 17 reasons you can and the 14 reasons you can't? No, he wasn't. He's basically saying what you're doing is wrong. And again, it's headline. And for all we know, he may well have taught the other reasons also, because the Sermon on the Mount is probably 2 to 3 days worth of teaching compressed into 3 chapters. So it's basically bullet points. So to start with, we can see that if all we had was the Sermon on the Mount, we would have a very restrictive teaching on divorce. But we don't have that. We have other things that are taught. Now, Christ also said in Mark 10, 10 through 12, into the house the disciples began questioning him about this again. And he said to them, "Whosoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery." Again, sounds very clear and very plain. I would say, again, you have to look at the audience and also look at the fact of, is it modified or changed by Paul? Now, that doesn't mean there's a contradiction. It means Jesus is giving a summary statement. And in general, at that point in time, adultery was the reason for divorce. But the point is, it's not the only reason. But certainly that is a reason as far as that goes. Now, if we continue on, again, we got to keep it in context here. I think one of the things we've got to say is these verses by Christ have often been taken to mean you cannot divorce for anything but adultery. I've actually heard it taught in churches. If your husband is smashing your teeth out, if your husband kicks you to the floor, if your husband is giving you a black eye, if your husband is an absolute creep who just likes to beat on you like a punching bag, then according to Jesus, you just got to stick with him. I've heard that church taught in more than one church. I don't believe that. And one of the reasons I don't believe that is because of some of the things that we're going to see here in 1 Corinthians as we go on. I think there are reasons for divorce other than just adultery. By the same token, if we look at divorce today has gone to the other extreme. Normally you don't have the problem of not getting divorced. Normally it's a problem of, hey, we're getting divorced for whatever. Don't feel like being married anymore. I'm going to find myself. I don't love you anymore. On and on and on, whatever the reasons. And those are not biblical reasons, by the way. Now again, we want to turn back to, is there a contradiction of the Bible between Jesus and Paul? Now, one of the things that we've got to say is, when Jesus was talking, and I think this is important, it's recording his conversations. And what I'm saying is, sometimes we say things because of our audience that we don't expand upon that we otherwise would. I mean, let me give you an example. Let's say that I have a user who knows nothing about computers, and that user is just totally lost, and I say, okay, first thing you do, turn on your computer, okay? Now, I don't say to them, turn on your computer, but if the hard drive doesn't spin up, then go ahead and check this on the power. Check your connections. Also, how's your Ethernet connection? Have you set your IP address, etc.? I don't say that. Now, if I was talking to a technician, if I was talking to a networking guy like Caleb or something like that, or even Daniel if he was here, if I was talking to one of those guys, I might say a lot of other things. But as a summary statement to that user, I would probably just say to that user, turn on your computer. I wouldn't go through every possible thing that could possibly happen. It's normal talking. We talk that way. Jesus was the same way. If I say to Linda, hey, would you like me to make candied pork loin tonight? I wouldn't have to say, we'll talk about that later maybe, but anyway, I wouldn't have to say to Linda, should I make mashed potatoes with that? Because she knows if you make candied pork loin, it produces a juice, and not a gravy, but a juice. It's really good. And you put the juice on the potatoes, and it's wonderful when it finishes up, okay? If I were describing this to someone who'd never been to my house for candied pork loin, I'd have to tell them it comes with mashed potatoes. I don't have to say that to Linda. She already knows. In the same way, when Christ is talking about these things, he's giving summary statements in general. And when Paul gives more specifics, it's not contradictions, it's expanding on the teaching. And that's important to know because we don't have contradictions here. Paul is expanding on Christ's teaching. Now let's actually get into the text here, starting in verses 10 and 11. But to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord. Now let me stop right there. Remember we talked about this, Paul saying, I've got some opinion in this other section. I got practical advice, which he just gave for 3 or 4 verses. Now he's saying, this isn't practical advice, this is a command. You don't have any choice on this. So it says, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband. But if she does leave, let her remain unmarried or else reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not send his wife away. To understand what he's saying here, we first have to understand the context of the chapter and what the Corinthians believe. What was the context of chapter 6, end of chapter 6 and chapter 7? Do you remember? Things like linking the Holy Spirit to a prostitute, the gross sin, sexual immorality, and then sexually pleasing your partner in the beginning of chapter 7 here. One of the beliefs that the Corinthians appeared to have is that perhaps if you were married as a believer to a non-believer, you were somehow polluting the body of Christ by having sex with the non-believer who was your spouse. Well, Paul's not saying that. Paul was never trying to say that. This was, again, Corinthians were a very mixed up church. They were a church that had a lot of problems. So when Paul is addressing this, what he's saying to them is, no, don't leave your husband or your wife because you became a believer. So it's critical to understand the context here. In addition to that, note also, this goes both ways. Under the Hebrew law, basically it would have pretty much been the man's choice whether they get divorced or not. Not here. Paul's saying, hey, it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, you have certain obligations. If you're married, stay married. And in addition to that, if you leave, wait to see if you can be reconciled and remain unmarried, at least under these circumstances. It's not quite talking about divorce yet. We're getting there. Now, one of the questions comes up is, with what we just read, is it biblical to get remarried after separating or after divorce? Now, one of the things I have to say is, if there is no biblical reason for getting married, and we're going to expand on what they are, if there's no biblical reason for getting married, then no, I don't believe you actually have the option to remarry after divorce as a believer. Can you do that? Yes, you can. Is it appropriate? No. But again, it's not just adultery. We're going to see some other reasons here as well, I think. But the first thing to say is, it doesn't mean you can just get divorced because you don't like somebody or something like that, walk away and say, now I'm entitled to marry within the faith. That's not what the Bible's saying. It's a tighter restriction than some churches have and far looser than others. One of the other things we have to look at for remarrying is, whether you can remarry, is what is the purpose of not remarrying? Well, the purpose is perhaps there can be a reconciliation. So one of the things we have to look at here is reconciliation even possible? Now let me give you two examples of where I believe remarriage is appropriate no matter what the reason for the divorce was. Number one, if the original spouse has died, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. If the original spouse has died, you're free to remarry. Is there any chance of reconciliation? No. The guy's dead or the woman's dead. You're not going to get back together again. In that case, you're free to remarry a believer once the person dies. Number two, I also believe, personally, that when you get to a spot where the previous spouse remarries someone else, then you're also free to remarry, because again, reconciliation is not possible. Because what is the whole purpose of this? The purpose of staying unmarried is the hope of reconciliation. Now, if we also look, I'm going to jump forward out of our text to verse 39 for just a moment. Verse 39 said, "A wife is bound as long as her husband lives. But if her husband is dead, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord." I think that also applies to people who have already been divorced. If the person dies, you're free to remarry. Again, no chance of reconciliation. So this isn't just something that I'm pulling out myself. This is something I believe that Paul's indicating here. Now, one other thing you'll note that's interesting is, and one of the reasons I say that Paul is expanding on what Jesus said and not contradicting it is, if you look at what we've just read so far for reasons for divorce, anybody notice what's not there? Not listed? Adultery. It's not listed in this chapter here. Why are you getting divorced? Adultery. Not listed. Does that mean adultery is not a valid reason for divorce? No, it means it is a valid reason for divorce. But what it means is, it's already understood by this audience that adultery is a reason for divorce. Jesus said it, they already knew it, it's already understood, so there's no reason for Paul to go back and repeat that. He's now expanding upon it and giving additional details. Because otherwise you'd have to say, well, Paul's contradicting Jesus as well because Paul's not allowing for adultery. But that's not what's happening here. These are complementary passages. These are not exclusive passages, okay? The other thing I think that I want to say here, and that I faced myself prior to getting married. I mentioned before that I was married when I was 35 years old. That is not a young age to get married. And before I got married, one of the things that started happening was I had offers to go out on dates with women who were divorced and Christians. And I honestly had no idea if it was right or wrong. And one of the things I started doing is, fortunately, before I ever met Linda, I actually came up with, when is it appropriate, from studying the Bible, when is it appropriate to date a woman who's divorced or not, or who's divorced, and when is it not appropriate? And the reason I say this to you is, if you're single, if you're divorced, if whatever your situation is here, figure out before you get into a relationship whether it's appropriate to date or not. Because I guarantee you, if you get into a relationship and you love that person and you fall for that person and your hormones are racing, you will find some way to make that text say, yeah, it's okay to marry her. I didn't want to be in that spot. I also didn't start dating a woman and then, maybe I'll ask in 3 months if why her reason for divorce. Linda and I talked fairly quickly about her reasons to divorce, and she frankly had multiple reasons for a valid biblical divorce. Matter of fact, when we got married, one of the things that happened with the pastor is he came to us and he said, before I do this wedding, I need to know why you got divorced. He told her why. He said, bingo, you got it. So again, there were no problems in our case. But I didn't want to try to decide after the fact or while I was in the relationship. And as I said, if you're young here, if you're single, think this through beforehand, because it's a lot easier to figure this out beforehand than it is after the fact while you're in the relationship. Now, if we go on to verse 12, we start seeing some commands for mixed marriages. And let me say also before I go on here, when I say mixed marriages, I do not mean racially mixed. I mean believer and unbeliever. One of the reasons I say that is the Bible does not have anything to say about mixed marriages for racially, which is actually good because what it's saying is treat them the same as any other marriage. Now, I have met people, including some old professors that I knew, who tried to read things into the Bible to say you could not have mixed racial marriages. They were grotesquely wrong in taking things out of context. But my point is, there's nothing in the Bible at all that says whether you can marry interracially or not, or whether you can date interracially. It's just not there. Which again means I wouldn't worry about it. But here we're talking about a mixed marriage being an unmarried person and a married person. What do we do when we got this situation? Now if we read verse 12, it says, "But to the rest I say, not the Lord, but if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, let him not send her away." Now, interesting here when you say, "I say, but not the Lord," I think we're getting into the practical advice here again. But here's what he said in 12, and also then let's read 13 because it goes with it. "And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, let her not send the husband away." It's pretty simple. If you're married and your spouse doesn't want to leave you, and you become a believer, don't leave the spouse. Stay with the spouse. It's talking about the fact that marriage is still holy and valid, even if it's two unbelievers, or if it's a believer and an unbeliever. God intended for people to get married in most cases. And if you have two unbelievers getting married, that's fine, no problem at all. If you have two believers getting married, that's fine. It's still a good thing. Sometimes we think almost like, I've known people who think like, well, to only really have a good spiritual marriage, a good marriage, you've got to be two believers. You're not going to heaven, but you can still have a good marriage with two unbelievers who love each other and care about each other, okay? One of the things I was going to say here also is marriage at its core for centuries has been a religious ceremony. But by the same token, we also recognize that for those who are not religious, the state certainly, I believe, has a right to marry non-believers as well. We're not going to reject a non-believing marriage or something like that. So we've got a situation here where Paul's saying clearly, don't walk out on your spouse. And again, remember the belief the Corinthians had. Am I polluting the body of Christ by staying with an unbelieving spouse? That's what he's trying to answer here, and he's saying, no. Certainly not. Stay with your spouse. Now we get to verse 14, and verse 14 is at best a very confusing verse and a very controversial verse. And verse 14 says, "For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy." Huh? Where did this one come from? Okay? We have to look at what the text is actually saying and not saying. The other thing I want to say to you is I have heard people stand up and say, this is exactly what that means. And as soon as they said that, I usually tuned them out and said, you don't know what you're talking about. The reason being because anyone who tells you they know exactly what this passage means doesn't know what it means. I cannot tell you exactly what it means. I'm going to give you some thoughts on it. But it's a difficult passage to interpret. And no one knows for sure exactly what Paul meant. For one thing, it may have been contextual again, and there may be a piece of the context we're missing, and that's part of why we don't understand it. One of the theories, which it obviously is not, is it does not mean you married an unbeliever, you got a believer married to him, bingo, you're in, you get to heaven, you're saved all of a sudden. Some people believe it means that. It does not mean that. One of the things we have to see here also is when it's talking about sanctifying and it's talking about holy, Holy and sanctify are really the same root word in the Greek. However, there's a major difference between how it's used as a verb and how it's used as a noun. When it's talking about the husband being sanctified through the wife and the children being sanctified, it's the verb. And the reason that's important is because sanctified at its root means set apart. So somehow they are set apart as what it's saying. It's not saying they suddenly become holy. It's not saying they suddenly have righteousness or something like that. But somehow they're set apart in some fashion, and we're not exactly sure what that means. Now, I will give you my thoughts on possibilities on this. Number one, I think, and I've seen many cases where the husband or the wife who's unsaved, their behavior changes because of the saved spouse. And not only does their behavior change, but in many cases they actually become believers. The saved spouse is able to lead them to the Lord. By the same token also, don't go into it figuring, now I'm a believer, he's got to come to the Lord, or she's got to come to the Lord. You can't force them. But the point being is that this is something where I think what this sanctifying may be talking about here is set apart in that there is a Christian influence in the house. Again, I'm not positive, but I think that's the most logical reason for it. By the way, let me interject here with something else that has to be said. This does not mean that it's fine for a believer to go looking for a non-believer so they can marry a non-believer because he or she is really hot, and therefore we'll convert them after we get married. That's not what it's talking about. What it's talking about is someone who becomes a believer after they're married. Now, let me say this also. It doesn't mean you're a believer, you married an unbeliever, that's it, life's over, you're done. It doesn't mean that either. Because we have that other extreme there where you just can't recover from this. As a matter of fact, if you think about it, if Christ's commands were the only valid command for divorce, where adultery is the only reason, and not only that, if you marry a person who's committed or who's a divorcee, you're an adulterer for the rest of your life. Wait, we can be forgiven for all our sins, but we can't be forgiven for that one because it takes our entire life with us. The only solution, obviously, is to murder the spouse, be forgiven for that, and then go ahead and get remarried. I don't think that's what Christ was talking about. But if you go logically and you take it to these extremes, you end up with some twisted, strange doctrines. And that's one of them. Let me go on and read verse 15 and 16 with this also. Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? I think one of these things, going back to me talking about the Christian influence in the house, Paul's talking here about saying, hey, if you stay married, you may well be the witness that brings your spouse to the Lord. But in addition to that, he's all of a sudden setting out something that Jesus never discussed. Jesus never talked about what if you become a believer and then your spouse leaves you because you become a believer. In those cases, Paul's saying you are absolutely free to divorce and remarry. Now that certainly isn't covered by Jesus. And one of the reasons I say not a contradiction but an expansion is, here we have a situation where Jesus was not going to go into all these details, but where Paul's saying, hey, this is the situation here. If your unbelieving husband or wife leaves, you're free to leave. Now, let me say this also. That does not mean that as a husband or a wife you can become such a nag or a pill that the person gets forced away and says, I can't live with them anymore. And then you turn around and say, oh, blessed be the unbeliever left and now I can remarry. No, it doesn't work that way. What it's saying is if you're faithful to God, if you're loving your spouse, and that spouse can't handle the fact that you become a believer, then you're free to remarry another believer afterwards. If we go on to verse 17 says, only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, in this manner let him walk. And thus I direct all the churches. A couple of interesting things here is, number one, if you're in a marriage and you become a believer and your spouse is not, it's not a mistake. Whatever state God has put you in, don't look at it as a mistake. Look at it as an opportunity. Look at it as a way to love your spouse and show your spouse the wonderful love of Christ and let them know you love them because Christ loves you. The other thing interesting here is it says that this is to all the churches. This is not a command just for Corinth. These are some instructions that all the churches should pay attention to. Now, we've gone through this as interpretation. I want to hit something on application because, let me say this, we generally have not really had a sermon on when can you divorce and when can you not. I want to do a quick summary for us here so that we know, or at least you'll know what I believe is appropriate or not. One of the things I got to say this as an elder, and I haven't asked, but I'm guessing Gene, Randy, and others have had the same questions sent to them. You almost can't be in a church and not get asked the question by somebody, can I divorce or can I remarry? Had people come to me that on multiple occasions through the years. Even not as an elder, just as a person who's read the Bible and know what's going on. Well, let me go to say a couple of things here. Number one, I am giving you opinion to some degree, but I think it's biblically based opinion. Let me give you two wrong views to start with. The one wrong view is divorce for any reason whatsoever. Doesn't make any difference. You feel like getting out of the marriage, get out. That's wrong. That's what many of the liberal churches have espoused nowadays. No problem. You want to get remarried in this church and you've got an unbiblical divorce and your spouse is still unmarried and your spouse is still alive, we'll marry you. We've talked about that. I don't think we would marry someone in that exact situation here. The other extreme is the scarlet D. Branded for life and forever you're a failure because you've been divorced. That is worse than murder. That is worse than any other thing you can think of. Because you are a perpetual adulterer for the rest of your life. That's wrong. That's not what the Bible is trying to say here. God has a plan for you, and it's not to walk around perpetually branded. Figuratively, of course, hopefully. All right, the other thing is, one of the reasons for divorce that is legit, that is, I think, unquestionably legitimate, is adultery by the spouse. I want to point that out. Not by you. It doesn't mean you want to get divorced, go fool around, and then you can get divorced. It means your spouse is committing adultery. Then it's legitimate to get a divorce. However, I should say something else. It doesn't mean the spouse commits adultery, you work it out, you forgive him, 10 years later, you remember you committed adultery, I'm free. That's not what it means either. I think once you take that person back and restore the marriage, I don't think you have the option of then saying adultery's fine and go that way. But I will say this, if the spouse commits adultery, then you're free to leave. You're free to get divorced and free to remarry a believer later on. When an unbeliever leaves a believer because the believer has become a... Whoa, that sentence is a... Yeah, I know. It's a correct sentence, but boy, was that coming out weird. When an unbeliever believes a believer because a believer has become a believer. Yeah, that works out. In that case, it's obviously from what Paul said, find a divorce. Again, it's not the preferred thing, but sure, go ahead. And you can remarry within the faith. But again, not because you're being such a pill that you force the other person out. I've known people that literally could never be married to a believer because they are such atheists or such whatever, it would just go against them so harshly, they could never stay married to a believer. In that case, no problem. I also believe that abuse is a reason for divorce, or at least separation. I don't believe that any woman, or guy for that matter, has the right to, or has the obligation to stand around and get beaten up. One thing, I don't know if you know it or not, but in New York State until 1966, the only reason for divorce was adultery. There have been some famous cases in New York State, one of which included a woman who was being beaten daily on a regular basis. This was back in the 1920s or 30s. She was being beaten daily, severely beaten, coming in with black eyes, bruised, and everything else. New York State would not allow her to have a divorce because adultery was the only reason. So what'd she do? She pulled out a gun and killed him. Then she went to the electric chair for it. There have been problems with some of the laws where, frankly, she should have been able to get the divorce before that. She certainly should have been able to separate. Not in New York State until 1966. I also believe that abandonment is a reason for divorce that's legitimate. Abandonment does not mean he left 30 minutes ago for 7-Eleven and I don't know where he is, okay? Abandonment meaning this guy took off, this woman took off, gone for a couple of years, we have no idea if they're dead or alive or whatever, they've just split, or even if you know where they are, if they've abandoned you completely in that marriage. Yeah, well, I know he's living with some woman down in Tijuana or whatever, okay? That's a legitimate reason for divorce. So there are legitimate reasons here as well. But let me go to the other extreme. Not permitted. I love someone else. I found someone else better. It's not like a coin collection where you're constantly looking for a better example of that particular date. You can't just pop a new husband in or a new wife in when you find a better one. It's for life. But again, it's not because you fell in love with someone else. In addition to that, it's not valid to say, I'm not in love anymore. One of the problems we have is this expression, in love. It's almost like, how do you get married? Well, you wait for this magical feeling to overcome you, and then you know something? There are magical feelings that overcome you when you're on your way to get married. But that's not the basis of it. The point being, that comes along with it. Love and being in love are two completely different things. Love is something we choose to do. No matter how you feel about your spouse currently, you can choose to love your spouse and show love to your spouse. You can choose to act lovingly toward your spouse. Simply saying my feelings are gone and I'm no longer in love is not a valid reason for divorce. Not for a believer. It's also not valid to be, I'm tired of marriage. I've been married too long, I want to find myself now. No, that's not valid. You made the decision to get married. Now, the other question again comes up, what about remarriage after divorce? If you have any biblical reason for divorce and you follow through on it biblically, then you can get remarried afterwards. It doesn't make sense to say you can get divorced but you can never be remarried again. A biblical reason, these we've discussed, are fine. In addition to that, if the original spouse dies, I don't care if you've been divorced or not, once that spouse has died, you're no longer connected to them. There's several passages we can go to for that. But the death of a spouse is always provided it's not you killing them, but the death of a spouse is always a valid reason for saying you can remarry. Also, I believe that if the spouse remarries, then you're free to remarry. Again, the reason being there's no hope of reconciliation. When Paul talked about being content in whatever state he's in, I think he was referring to this as the idea being that you don't want to go try to break up an old marriage or new marriage to try to restore an old marriage. The key here again is no chance of reconciliation. I want to also deal briefly with dealing with a mixed marriage. I don't know if we have people in this church who are dealing with a mixed marriage or not. I guarantee, well, not guarantee, but I can say this, if you're not, you probably will have friends who will ask you for advice or you'll know about at some point in time. My first advice in general is stay in the marriage. There are exceptions we've talked about. But in general, stay in the marriage. Show love to your spouse. Show your spouse what Jesus Christ is all about. Will that spouse get saved? Will that spouse turn into a wonderful person? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. No way of knowing. But we're not free to just leave as long as the spouse still wants to stay married simply because we've become a believer. I have some other pieces of advice here. Do not try to force the spouse to become a believer. I've seen cases where the believer suddenly, I'm a believer, I'm going to live this holy life and show you how wrong you are and why you have to have Jesus. Oh yeah, that'll really convince the person to change. You show them to change by the fact of how much you love that other person, how much you love your spouse, and you let them know that the reason you love them is because what Christ has done for you. The other thing also that's a mistake is to try to subject the unbelieving spouse to the rules for believers. You know something? The unbelieving spouse may not think certain things are sin that you see as sin. And then then the believer can try to say, biblically you're wrong. Well, yeah, of course they're wrong. They're unbelievers. What do you expect? They're going to believe as an unbeliever. The way to change them is not simply to try to force them to be a Christian through their actions, because that won't work. The way to change them is to show them love and get them to become a believer. Then the changes will occur more naturally. Again, I would say, make sure they know that you're showing them love as a believer because of what Christ has done for you. That's the most effective. And I've seen a number of cases where people have become believers late in life because they had a loving spouse that kept showing them that. And the final thing I want to say is, if you are a believer married to an unbeliever, or you're advising people in that situation, I would say to the spouse that's a believer, pray for the unbelieving spouse. Through your actions and through your prayers, that's how that spouse can be reached for Christ. not through standing up and wagging a finger at them and telling them all the reasons why they have to act like a Christian when they're not. I'm hoping this may have cleared up a few things on divorce, on mixed marriages. And I don't know if this applies to anybody in the church or not, but I'm hoping if it does, even if it doesn't, that we're better equipped to answer the questions of people that we're going to encounter in the world and encounter in other churches. Let's go ahead and pray.